After my parents passed, I took over their family cafe. On day one, a customer spat in my face and shouted, "You'll never be her. Your mom had class." I smiled, went inside, then put up a sign that said, "New owner, new rules." By week's end, they were begging for my forgiveness. Me 37 female took over my late parents' beloved small-town cafe. On my very first day, a regular 60s female spit in my face and humiliated me publicly, saying I would never live up to my mother's reputation. I stayed calm, put up a bold sign saying "New owner, new rules," and made major changes to the cafe. I faced cruel backlash at first, but stood firm. In the end, the people who hated me the most came back begging for forgiveness, and now, the cafe is more alive than it ever was. When my mom and dad passed away, I wasn't ready. Not ready emotionally. Not ready financially. Definitely not ready to inherit a 60-year-old cafe in a town where everyone still thinks your worth is measured by your last name and how many pies you bring to the 4th of July fair. But ready or not, life shoved it into my hands. It happened so fast it still feels like a blur sometimes. My dad, Bennett, had a stroke. He was gone within a week. My mom, Rosa, tried her best to stay strong after he passed, but honestly, it broke something inside her. Less than 2 years later, cancer finished the job. I was living in Boston at the time, working in marketing, hustling like crazy just to make rent. My boyfriend at the time, or maybe more accurately, the guy I lived with because it was convenient, didn't even look up from his laptop when I told him my mom was gone. I remember standing there, suitcase in one hand, keys in the other, and thinking, there's no coming back from this. Not just from death, but from the life I had built around avoiding home. When I got back to Wiscasset, Maine, this tiny, harbor town with more lobstermen than stoplights, the town looked exactly the same. Same cracked sidewalks. Same sagging telephone poles. Same Harbor Light Cafe, squatting proudly at the end of Water Street like it had always been there, which it basically had. Inside the cafe, everything smelled like cinnamon and sadness. My Aunt Delia handed me the keys with tears in her eyes, and for a long minute, I just stood there in the doorway. Half of me wanted to run. Half of me wanted to cry. Neither of those things would fix anything. So instead, I opened the front door and flipped the closed sign to open. I told myself, one day at a time. The first day started off deceptively normal. The sunrise over the harbor was pink and gold, like a watercolor painting. The bells over the door jingled in that old, familiar way. I recognized a lot of the early customers, folks who had been coming to Harbor Light longer than I'd been alive. Mrs. Abernathy with her blue hair and crocheted scarves. Big Marty from the marina. The 2 retired teachers who always ordered the same thing, coffee, black, and 1 molasses cookie, split between them. For about an hour, everything felt almost okay. Then she came in. Her name was Meredith Calloway, and even if you didn't know her name, you could spot her from across a room. Long brown coat. Tight mouth. A presence that practically demanded attention without her saying a word. She ordered a black coffee and a slice of lemon pie. I handed them over with what I hoped was a warm smile. She took one look at me, sneered, and without warning, spat in my face. The cafe went dead silent. All I could hear was the soft drip of the coffee machine behind me. "You'll never be her," Meredith hissed. "Your mom had class. You're nothing but a fraud." For a second, I just stood there, stunned. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my cardigan. The logical part of my brain told me to scream, to cry, to throw her out. But something deeper, something stubborn and sharp in mine, rose up instead. I smiled. Not a fake smile either. A real, dangerous one. Without a word, I walked to the back room, grabbed a marker and a piece of poster board, and wrote in big block letters, "New owner. New rules. Act right or stay out." I taped it to the front window, right at eye level. People noticed. The rest of the day was rough. People glared. Whispered. Some left without ordering. A couple of teenage boys threw sugar packets onto the counter like they were making some kind of statement. I cleaned up the mess without a word. I refused to cry. I refused to leave. The next morning, I came in 2 hours early. I scrubbed every surface until the place smelled like bleach and lemons. I rewrote the menu, keeping some of the classics but adding my own twist, Mom's real recipes, not the watered-down town favorites she'd started serving just to please people. I found a local coffee roaster from Portland and ordered a better blend. It was expensive, but I didn't care. I even raised prices. No more endless bottomless mugs for $1.25. When customers complained, I smiled and said, "You're welcome to go somewhere else." Some did. I let them. It felt like ripping off a scab, painful, but necessary. Mrs. Calloway came back midweek, standing at the counter like she was waiting for me to apologize. I didn't. Instead, I set down a fresh batch of pastries and started wiping down the counter, ignoring her completely. She sniffed and stalked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. By Thursday, it all exploded. Mrs. Calloway gathered a little army of the old guard, retirees, busybodies, folks who had known my parents longer than I had been alive, and they stormed in first thing in the morning. They didn't even sit down. Meredith rapped her spoon against a glass and announced loudly that they were boycotting Harbor Light Cafe until this disgrace, meaning me, was corrected. I stood behind the counter, hands folded neatly, and listened to every word. When she finished, I smiled the same smile I had smiled when she spit in my face. "You're welcome to do that," I said. Calm. Even. But Harbor Light isn't a museum. It's a living thing. It has to grow. Or it dies. She looked like she wanted to slap me. Instead, she and her crew turned on their heels and marched out, leaving the door swinging. For about 10 minutes, I stood there, feeling the walls breathe around me. Empty chairs. Empty booths. The echo of my parents' hard work. I almost broke then. Almost. But then 2 new customers wandered in, a young couple from Portland, holding hands, looking around curiously. They ordered lattes and a slice of my homemade blueberry buckle. Sat at a corner table. Smiled at each other. I realized then, I wasn't losing the town. I was building something new. The next few days were some of the loneliest of my life. Every time I heard the bells over the door jingle, a part of me flinched, wondering if it would be another angry face, another nasty comment, another side-eyed glance full of judgment. But it wasn't, not always. Slowly, a different kind of customer started coming in. Younger couples from nearby towns. Tourists passing through on their way to Boothbay Harbor. Artists, musicians, families who didn't quite fit the mold of old Wiscasset but had never felt welcome enough to settle here before. I realized that the old guard had unintentionally done me a favor. By making a scene, by boycotting, they had sent a message: this place had changed. At first, it was a trickle. Then a stream. Then a steady flow. One morning, Fiona Archer, who ran the pottery studio down the street, came in with a bundle of fresh wildflowers. She placed them in a mason jar on the counter without saying anything at first. Just a small, soft offering. Finally, she said, "We've been waiting for someone like you." It nearly broke me. I nodded and looked away quickly, pretending to adjust the chalkboard menu so she wouldn't see my eyes watering. Later that afternoon, I found a basket by the back door. Inside was a loaf of homemade sourdough bread, a jar of local honey, and a card that said, "For strength. Fiona." It sat on the shelf above the coffee machine for weeks after, unopened, like a little monument to kindness. Of course, not everyone came around that easily. Some people would walk in, glance around like the air itself offended them, and stomp right back out. Others stayed, but complained loudly. About the newfangled menu. About the fancy city coffee. About the attitude. I smiled through it. Bit my tongue raw some days. I told myself that building something lasting was more important than pleasing people who had already decided to hate me. Still, there were nights when I closed the cafe early, turned off all the lights, and just sat in the dark at one of the booths, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building settling around me. Sometimes I talked to my mom and dad under my breath, like they were still there. "You wouldn't believe the drama, Dad," I'd mutter. "Mom, I hope you're proud of me." "I'm trying," I'd whisper. Sometimes I could almost feel them smiling back. By the second week, something interesting happened. One by one, the people who had led the little boycott started drifting back in. Not with apologies, not yet, but with cautious glances and stiff shoulders, like maybe they were testing the water to see if they'd still be welcome. I always served them with the same quiet, polite professionalism my parents had taught me. No special treatment. No resentment, either. Meredith Calloway stayed away the longest. I saw her sometimes across the street, standing outside the general store, pretending not to look over at the cafe window. Her mouth would twist, and she'd turn away quickly. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. One Thursday morning, just before the lunch rush, the door chimed and there she was. Standing in the doorway like a storm cloud. The cafe had a low hum that day, quiet conversations, the clink of coffee cups, the scrape of forks against plates. Everything seemed to freeze for a second when Meredith stepped inside. I kept wiping down the counter, heart pounding in my ears. She walked up, stiff-backed, and ordered a black coffee. Her voice was lower than I remembered. Almost tired. I poured the coffee, slid it across the counter, and said, "That'll be $2.50. No extra words. No smiles. Just business." She fished a crumpled bill from her coat pocket, set it on the counter, and hovered there awkwardly. For a second, I thought she might leave it at that. But she didn't. "I miss your mother," Meredith said finally, voice rough like gravel. "We all do. She was the heart of this town. When she died, we didn't know what to do." I said nothing. Let the silence stretch. Meredith picked up the coffee and added, quieter still, "I shouldn't have taken it out on you." Then she turned and left without another word. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, staring at the sunlight slanting through the windows, dust motes spinning like tiny galaxies. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. But it was something. It was a start. The cafe kept growing. Slowly. Surely. Word spread. People started coming to Harbor Light not just for nostalgia, but because they genuinely loved the place again. Loved the hand pies, the strong coffee, the live music on Fridays, the poetry readings once a month. A new spirit filled the walls. Sometimes, when I closed up at night and flipped the chairs onto the tables, I'd look around and see all the little signs of change, the new shelves, the mismatched mugs people had donated, the kids' drawings tacked up by the register, and feel a deep, aching sense of peace. Like maybe, just maybe, I had done something right. As the weeks turned into months, I fell into a rhythm. Morning prep started at 5 a.m., with me dragging myself out of bed in the freezing dark, pulling on an old hoodie and sneakers, and heading down to the cafe with Miso, my fat, grumpy cat, giving me dirty looks for leaving him behind. I'd unlock the door, flip on the lights, and get to work while the town still slept. Mixing batter for the day's scones, setting out the creamers, brewing the first pot of coffee. There was something almost sacred about those early hours, when the world was still quiet, and the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerators and the soft splatter of rain against the windows. It didn't erase the loneliness, but it dulled it. Most mornings, it was just me and Tommy, the teenager I had hired when I first reopened, and sometimes Fiona would swing by with fresh flowers or pottery mugs for me to sell by the register. Once in a while, other familiar faces started returning, too. Faces I thought I had lost after the initial explosion. There was Frank, who owned the hardware store. He came back for his usual black coffee, one sugar, without saying a word about the boycott. There was Deidre, who ran the bookshop. She started leaving flyers for her author signings at the front counter again. Even Big Marty shuffled in one Saturday morning, mumbled something that might have been an apology into his coffee, and sat down without any fanfare. It wasn't a dramatic reunion. It wasn't some huge moment of triumph. It was quieter. Realer. It was how real healing looks, slow, awkward, unfinished. One afternoon, as I was wiping down tables after the lunch rush, I noticed a man lingering by the pastry case. He wasn't familiar, which was rare in Wiscasset. Tall, late 30s maybe, with messy dark hair and a battered denim jacket. He was squinting at the scones like they were some kind of puzzle. I was halfway through wiping a table when he caught me looking and gave a sheepish half-smile. "Are these blueberry or something fancier?" he asked, tapping the glass. His voice was rough, low, the kind of voice that made you think of late-night radio shows and cheap vinyl records. "Blueberry lemon," I said, straightening up and tossing the rag onto a chair. He nodded, considering. "I'll take 2. I boxed them up, handed them over, and told him the total. He fished a few crumpled bills from his pocket and slid them across the counter. Before he left, he hesitated. "I'm Eli," he said. "Just moved into the cabin near Miller's Pond." I nodded politely. "Welcome to Wiscasset." "I'm Mara." He gave another quick smile, shy, but not unfriendly, and left, the doorbells jingling behind him. I watched him go, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. Not the desperate, lonely kind of curiosity that grabs onto anyone willing to pay you attention. Something quieter. Something patient. I didn't think much of it then. But life has a funny way of planting seeds you don't even realize are growing. Over the next few weeks, Eli became a semi-regular at the cafe. Never pushy. Never lingering too long. He'd come in, order coffee and a pastry, maybe sit by the window for an hour with a notebook or a battered paperback. Sometimes he would nod at me in that casual, no-pressure way small-town folks greet each other. Sometimes he wouldn't say anything at all. I liked it. I liked that he didn't treat me like some sideshow attraction, the girl who took over Harbor Light, who changed everything, who ruined the old way. He just treated me like a person. One rainy afternoon, he stayed later than usual, nursing a cup of black coffee and sketching something in his notebook. The cafe was nearly empty by then. I was stacking chairs when he looked up and said, almost shyly, "You ever think about putting up some art? Local stuff?" I shrugged. Hadn't really thought about it. He smiled a little. "Might be cool. Lot of talented folks hiding around here." I nodded, filing the idea away without committing. But later that night, lying in bed with miso sprawled across my legs, I thought about it again. Maybe Eli was right. Maybe there was more to this town than grudges and gossip and old bitterness. Maybe there were still good things here. Good people. Spring crept up on Wiscasset like it was afraid to be seen. First came the rains, long and gray and heavy. Then the crocuses, bursting up through the frost-burned grass like tiny fists. Then the tourists, trickling back in with their cameras and sandals and shrieking kids. Harbor Light Cafe bloomed with the season. New faces. New energy. One Friday night, during an open mic event Fiona had helped organize, the cafe was so full we had to prop open the door just to let the air circulate. People spilled out onto the sidewalk, drinking coffee from paper cups, laughing, chatting, and listening to music. I stood behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine, and watched it all with a strange feeling growing inside me, something halfway between pride and disbelief. If someone had told me, that first terrible day, that I would get here, that I would rebuild everything from ashes and spit and stubbornness, I would have laughed them out of the room. But here I was. Still standing. Still fighting. Still building. Eli came to almost every event, always keeping to the edges, always quiet. Sometimes I caught him sketching little things, the stage, the crowd, the old ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead. Once, he caught me watching and held up his sketchpad with a small smirk. It was a quick, rough drawing of the cafe, full of messy lines and too much heart. "You make it look better than it is," I joked. He shrugged. "Nah. Just seeing how it is. I didn't know what to say to that. Maybe I didn't need to. Summer came fast after that. The harbor was filled with sailboats and the air always smelled like salt and fried clams. Tourists flooded the sidewalks, blocking traffic with their oversized strollers and cameras, while the locals mostly grumbled and pretended not to like it, even though everyone secretly needed the business. Harbor Light Cafe was busy most days now. Sometimes I barely had time to wipe down a table before another customer slid into a seat. Tommy had gone off to college by then, and I had hired a few more part-time help, Nora, a sharp-witted single mom who could outpace anyone on the floor, and Drew, a shy culinary school dropout who baked like a dream. The rhythm of the place had changed. Less tension, more laughter. Less expectation, more life. Still, not everyone was happy. I caught whispers sometimes, muttered complaints about the new crowd, about how Harbor Light wasn't the same anymore. Some of the old regulars who had drifted back after the boycott still treated me like an intruder. They'd sit stiffly, drink their coffee like it was a punishment, and leave without ever looking me in the eye. I learned to live with it. I thought that was the worst of it. I was wrong. It happened on a Wednesday morning, just as the first ferry horn sounded across the bay. I was in the kitchen pulling scones out of the oven when Nora came rushing in, apron askew, face pale. "Mara," she said, breathless. "You need to see this." I wiped my hands on a towel and followed her outside. Taped to the front window, where everyone could see it, was a cheap piece of printer paper. On it, in thick black letters, "Bring back Rose's Harbor Light. Boycott this fraud." Underneath were 24 signatures. Some were old regulars. Some I recognized vaguely from around town. And right at the top, in proud looping cursive, was Meredith Calloway. I stood there, staring at it, feeling like someone had knocked the wind out of me. The street was already buzzing. Tourists passing by slowed down to gawk. Locals crossed the street to pretend they hadn't seen anything. Nora hovered behind me, waiting for me to say something. I didn't. Not right away. Instead, I peeled the paper off the glass carefully, folded it once, and tucked it into my back pocket. Then I turned around and flipped the closed sign on the door. Inside, I locked the door, leaned against the counter, and closed my eyes. My hands were trembling. Not from fear. From rage. It took me the rest of the day to decide what to do. I scrubbed every inch of the cafe, not because it needed it, but because I needed it, the mindless motion, the sharp clean smell of bleach, the sense of control over something, anything. That night, I sat on the back steps of the cafe, watching the harbor lights dance on the water. Miso pressed against my side, purring. I thought about my parents. About all the sacrifices they made to build Harbor Light. About how Mom had started bending herself into knots to please people like Meredith. How she had smiled and baked and hosted and given everything until there was nothing left for herself. I thought about the promise I made the day I unlocked that door. New owner. New rules. The next morning, before the sun even broke the horizon, I was back at the cafe with a hammer and a handful of nails. I built a board by the front window, a giant, eye-level cork board framed in old driftwood I found at the beach. On it, I pinned a single sheet of paper: Harbor Light Cafe is a space for kindness, creativity, and community. Hate has no home here. If that's a problem, there's the door. Below it, I set out a box of index cards and markers, inviting customers to pin up their own notes, memories, poems, drawings, words of encouragement. By noon, the board was covered. There were stories about first dates that started at Harbor Light. Kids' crayon drawings of the cafe. Notes about how much people loved the blueberry buckle, the music nights, the laughter. Eli pinned up a sketch, a simple, quick drawing of the cafe window at sunset. Fiona wrote a poem about resilience. Nora's little boy drew a picture of a cat, a lumpy, wide-eyed version of Miso sitting behind the counter. Every time someone added something new, it felt like another stone being placed in a foundation I hadn't even realized I was building. I didn't take the hate poster to the police. I didn't call anyone out by name. I didn't need to. The board said everything for me. Of course, Meredith didn't give up easily. A week later, she showed up at the cafe, flanked by two of her closest friends, heavy-set, sour-looking women who had been muttering about the good old days since before I was born. They didn't sit down. They hovered by the door, arms crossed. "You're destroying what your mother built," Meredith said, voice low but clear. The cafe quieted around us. Even the espresso machine seemed to hush. I set down the tray I was carrying and faced her. "My mother built this place to bring people together," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not to let a few bitter people decide who belonged and who didn't." Meredith's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around, maybe expecting support. She didn't get it. Fiona stood up from her table. Eli set down his coffee and stood too, silent but steady. Nora came out from the kitchen, hands on her hips, apron dusted with flour. One by one, the cafe rose up around me. Not with shouting. Not with anger. With presence. With choice. Meredith's face turned a deep, mottled red. She muttered something under her breath and stormed out, her friends trailing behind her like lost dogs. The door swung shut with a final, satisfying clang. I stood there for a long moment, chest heaving, the smell of fresh coffee and warm scones filling the room. Then I smiled. A real smile. After Meredith and her crew stormed out that day, something shifted for good. The cafe felt lighter. Brighter. People who had been sitting quietly for months started opening up, talking, laughing, treating Harbor Light like a second home again instead of a battlefield. Parents brought their kids after school for cookies. Teenagers started studying in the corner booths. Retirees hosted knitting circles and book clubs. One evening, Eli stayed late after a poetry reading. The cafe was half-lit, chairs up on tables, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. I wiped down the counter while he nursed a cup of black coffee. "You did it," he said quietly. I glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "You made it yours," he clarified. I set the rag down, feeling a slow warmth spread through my chest. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe it. "Couldn't have done it without the hate mail," I said dryly, making him chuckle. He tapped his coffee cup thoughtfully. "Have you ever thought about making it official?" "What is official?" I asked. He gave a small, crooked smile. "Community nights. Art shows. Open mics. Turn Harbor Light into a place where people want to come together." I blinked at him. It was so obvious, so simple, I almost laughed. I didn't answer him then, but that night I stayed up sketching plans in a battered notebook, everything from art nights to writing workshops to local makers' markets. Not just a cafe. A community. I could almost hear my parents' voices in the back of my mind, proud and teasing. "About damn time, kiddo." A few weeks later, something even bigger happened. The town council announced that the old town hall, a beautiful, crumbling brick building at the edge of Main Street, was up for sale. Developers from out of town were already sniffing around, looking to turn it into a strip mall or condos. It felt like a gut punch. Wiscasset didn't need more parking lots. It needed places that meant something. Without thinking twice, I put together a proposal. I had no real money. No investors. No experience running anything bigger than a cafe. But what I did have was the town. The new Wiscasset. The one that had grown up around Harbor Light. Within 2 days, I had a petition with hundreds of signatures. Artists. Teachers. Shop owners. Parents. Tourists. Even a few people I never thought I'd win over, like Frank from the hardware store and Deidre from the bookshop, signed without hesitation. We pitched a plan: turn the old town hall into a community center. Art spaces, shared offices, a farmer's market every Saturday. A place for everyone. A real beating heart for the town. Meredith Calloway fought it tooth and nail. She organized angry meetings. Sent letters to the editor. Spread rumors about me, ridiculous things like how I was lining my pockets with outsider money or destroying local tradition. At the final town council meeting, she stood up, practically shaking with rage, and demanded the council sell the building to a developer offering cash on the spot. When my turn came to speak, I stood in front of the whole town, heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs, and told them the truth. About what Harbor Light had become. About what we had become. I didn't attack Meredith. I didn't need to. The truth spoke for itself. When I finished, the room burst into applause. Even people who had once glared at me over their coffee were clapping, nodding, smiling. The council voted. Unanimously. The building would go to the town. The dream would live. The very next week, Harbor Light threw a massive thank you block party. We pushed all the tables outside, strung fairy lights from the trees, set up booths with pottery, paintings, homemade jams, and local crafts. There was live music. Kids ran barefoot down the sidewalks. Elderly couples danced in the street. At one point, I spotted Meredith Calloway standing stiffly at the edge of the crowd, arms folded. She looked smaller somehow. Not angry. Just lost. For a moment, a strange pity stirred in my chest. But I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. She had made her choices. I had made mine. As the sun set over the harbor and the lights flickered on, I stood behind the counter of Harbor Light, watching the town laugh and dance and build something new, something real. Eli caught my eye from across the street, holding 2 cups of coffee. He lifted one toward me, grinning. I laughed and crossed the street to meet him. For the first time in years, my heart felt full. Not with grief. Not with anger. With belonging. I had built a home. Not by being who people expected me to be, but by being exactly who I was. And it was enough.